everyone, and welcome to the second of David Mayhew's Stimson Lectures on the Imprint of Congress. I just want to take 1 minute to welcome you all here and David. The Stimson Lectures series is the longest established and most distinguished lecture series at the MacMillan Center. It's produced books such as Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, Schelling's Arms and Influence, and a very interesting book shortly coming out from Michael Walzer, which was Stimson Lectures last year, called What Happened to National Liberation. So I think, and Mayhew's Stimson Lecture book, which will be published next year by Yale Press, will certainly belong in this company. I would just say one thing about David. He needs no introduction here, so I'm not going to give him an extensive one, particularly since nobody came here to listen to me today. But I would just say that David Mayhew is, all the time I've been here, is the platonic form of a colleague. And if you said, how do you measure that? How do you measure collegialness? There are many ways one could do that, but the way I think of it is, when I give my work to people to read, and you ask yourself, who gives you kind of comments that actually make you change what you've written? He's right at the top of the list, and and I think that's the most useful thing a colleague can do for you. And it's been great to have all your support all these years. So welcome, and this is the second of these 3 lectures on the Imprint of Congress, focusing on the history. So welcome.
I think you took some of my pages there, Ian, did you?
I don't think you did.
The first and second page, maybe?
This one?
I guess that one, there's another one. Yeah, that's it. That'll do it. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, these are my pages.
Yep. All right, thanks. Is the mic working okay? And the screen's working okay? Everything worked very nicely yesterday, and that's, have a wonderful setup here. Where I left us today, yesterday, the Imprint of Congress, I said I'm on a hunt for Congress's distinctive impact across American history, 225 years of the Republic, and each of a sequence of 13 transnational impulses that the USA has participated in all that time. And yes, there it is. And here it is. Let me give you the timeline again. This is what I put on the board last time, and I'll put it up again just as a preface to what I'm doing today. These are the 13 items that I will have talked about at the end of this. Are we okay?
No, this mic got pushed away.
I see. So,
yeah,
okay. We're okay now? Is that better? We're doing better? Is it enough? Okay, good. Thanks for coming up. That's great. Yep. All right. Yes. Now, yes. So there are 13, and I covered the first of them yesterday, since my time ran out and what I was bloviating about yesterday. And I'm saving the number 12 and 13 at the beginning of next Tuesday, so I want to cover 10 of these impulses today. So that's a lot. That means not more than about 4.5 minutes per item. So I need to trundle right along. There's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of material. I mean, next Tuesday I'm going to be more interpretive in talking about these things, but today it's a presentation of stuff, basically. What I'll try to do is to tease out some interesting stories about these matters as I go through. And in each case, I want to give you the transnational setting. Understand that these are transnationally appearing impulses. That's part of the technique. And I'll talk about what the American executive branch has been up to, and then I'll talk about what Congress has been up to. That'll be the frame for each discussion, although not necessarily exactly in that order. And again, next Tuesday, I want to say, yes, the interpretations I will want to engage in next Tuesday, they cover only so much. That is, I'll pick out some themes that will bore into a number of these items going over the 13, but they won't cover everything. There are particularities here. There's a kind of dog's breakfast quality to these 13 things all put together in some respects, I think, but that's okay. That's not my fault. There are some surprises, and in some cases, I'll just let the particularities that I talk about today just stand there, put them on the table, and leave them. That's the way I'm going to do it. Yes, but it's as I say, there are some surprises, and I think a lot of the stories are interesting. Last time I did the first of these, Launch of a New Nation, it was Hamilton Day. You remember of Broadway? We talked about Hamilton. Somebody else told me today you got to go see that. We did that. I don't need to do it again. There's the contribution then of the executive branch, which is major for the creation of the and sustenance of the American public, that was put put out by Hamilton, structuring the financial arrangements of the country, and they, as much as anything, they made evidently for the economic prosperity up here in North America during the 19th century. There it was. Congress, I thought, contributed a legitimizing role, and I'll just stop it and leave it there. We want to go on. Now we want to go on to the next one, which is this. The second, Continental Expansion. Continental Expansion. This centers the first half of the 19th century. And here is an impulse, the participation of which I think is really quite appalling. I told you last time that the term performance doesn't necessarily carry a positive valence. This is one instance where it doesn't. But still, I'm using the term performance. At the time, people would have thought about things that way, probably. And probably, at least for that reason, the term is merited. But I'm not saying I approve the one back on of what went on during these decades before the Civil War in this respect. During this transnational setting, continental expansion, that means across North America by the Americans, the English, the British settlers as they went west. What was happening across a transnational set of countries at this time, and actually the time sprawls a little back and also into the 1870s and 80s as you look around the world, is that European peoples were moving in what they saw as vacant spaces. That is the American West, Australia, New Zealand, Siberia at one point, the Cone countries of Latin America. These are places inhabited by indigenous people. Yet they were places to be taken over, after all, and inhabited and used, and they're usufruct, taken advantage of by European peoples moving in, of whom there were a lot. I mean, the settler pressure was just amazing in the 1830s and 40s, apparently coming from Great Britain into these places, just amazing. And the U.S. is just one of a pack in most respects here. No better, no worse, pretty bad, pretty brutal. It's the ethnic cleansing that we see in the U.S., and especially in Jacksonian times and the presidency in the 1830s, is just eerily similar to what was going on in Tasmania and New South Wales, that is, those now states of Australia at that time. Yes. But so the Americans, let me call them, they took over a lot of land and then they did something with it. The role of the executive during this, and we're talking just about the U.S. here now, which means chiefly the presidency, was this. The executive acquired the land, seized the land, got the land. That is, there it was. That's what executives do sometimes. And the initiative was there, from Jefferson through Polk, this going out and getting land from other people, from the Spanish, from the French, from the British, from the Indians, taking it over for use by the Americans. It was done by, these are familiar stories, by purchase, by annexation, by warfare, by rampages, by schemes down on the southern borders that would look to us today Putin-esque. I mean, what Putin's doing in the eastern Ukraine is rather similar to what some of these presidents were doing down in what were called the Floridas at the time. The Floridas at the time extended all the way from now West Florida west to almost New Orleans. They were called the Floridas, and the Americans were going down there and doing these things. Yes, that's what it is. Seizure of land and displacement of Indians. Displacement or killing of Indians to take that land. The Cherokee Nation went out, for example. A major actor in this, after all, as you well know, was Andrew Jackson, both as a general in the 20s or before that, and then as a president in the 1830s. I mean, Daniel Walker Howe, the great historian, has in one of his recent books, a very thick book, the question, what is Jacksonian democracy? And his answer is, well, in the first place, it's about the extension of white supremacy across the North American continent. And now we're seeing, now Jefferson's and Jackson's pictures are going to the wall. If you read now about these the Democrats are giving up on Jefferson, Jackson, they did us. I don't know what they're going to rename them, but they're not J and J anymore. All right, now, enough of that. That's pretty familiar. The role of Congress in all this, it's a different component of it. It's one of the most interesting literatures I came across. It's a big literature, a very fine literature, and it's not a new literature in this case. It's just newly discovered by me, this literature. Once they got the land, what did they do with it? Well, it was Congress's job, they presided just distributing the land, getting rid of the land. The land comes into public possession by the USA, then what happens to it? Just immense quantities of land west of the Alleghenies all the way finally to the West Coast, and taken from Mexico, a lot of it. Well, Congress made the rules. It didn't execute the rules, but Congress is at the switch in making the rules for getting rid of this land. It's public land, you understand, at the start, and what's going to happen to it? Is it going to become private? Now, Congress started in all this in the mid-1780s, actually before 1787. Scott mentions this, Jim Scott, in his book, Seeing Eye State. It was an astonishing move. This is one of the most rationalistic master plans ever generated by a legislature, came in the mid-1780s. That was to divide up the whole country into these little rectangles, which would define what the plots would be of land across the country. That's extremely rationalistic. That's not the kind of thing that legislatures ordinarily do. But after that, over 7 decades of trademark congressional politics, here's what happened. Getting rid of the land. I mean, this was a politician's dream. It's amazing that any politician ever lost an election in the U.S. during these decades. I mean, look, they had all this land to give away. Wouldn't you just love that if you're a politician? It's easier than taking money out of the Treasury when you don't have taxation. It was an immense fund of felicity for politicians, incumbent politicians during these decades. Here's what it was like, disposing of the land. Here are the themes during these, again, about 7 decades. The themes: keep lowering the land prices. That pleases people out there. They're selling it. Eventually, they went down to 0 in the 1860s and giving it away. Keep allowing smaller land plots, because that's what people wanted, farmers. Allow easy credit. People wanted to borrow out there so they could get the land. Then supply debt relief once the farmer debt piles up. Just do that. Then legitimize the squatters. There are always people coming onto the land and taking it over, and you got to figure out what to do with them. One answer was to let them have the land after they lived there, and that, generally speaking, that's what happened. Accommodate the war veterans. As veterans' benefits before the Civil War amounted mostly to giving people land if they'd served in wars. And then don't worry about the government making any money. And in fact, all this could have made a fortune out of this by selling this land. But at the end of the day, they about broke even, the government. And then finally, keep changing the rules over and over again, decade after decade. It's fascinating. It's populist. It's kind of a ragged, messy, volatile populism that describes this disposing of the land over a long period of time. And this was sometimes to the despair of the executives. The executive didn't like some of this. I mean, that includes Hamilton, it includes Andrew Jackson, it includes Gallatin, the Jeffersonian financial leader. Executives don't like to operate like this sometimes, and this is an instance. All right, that's that one. On to the next one. Mid-19th century consolidation. And here's what I'm thinking of here. I'm putting it in this basket. I kind of like this interpretation that some historians have come down with about the mid-19th century, particularly the 1860s. They're buying into them here. C.A. Bailey, nice book, 2003. In Crushing the Emergent Federate State, we're talking about the Civil War here and the abolishing of slavery in the USA. The Union was itself following or contributing to a much wider realignment in which large and unified nations and more centralized and economically sophisticated supremacies replaced the still loose and varied polities of the early 19th century. And there's a similar analysis here by the great comparative historian, I think, E.J. Hobsbawm, written back in, I think, published anyway last time in 1996. For one reason or another, 3 types of agrarian enterprise are under pressure: that serfdom, surface states, traditional non-capitalist peasant economies, and slavery. So what we had across much of the world in the centering in the 1860s, and I don't know why this happened, and nobody's got a good account. I mean, Hobsbawm opines that what's going on is that we're seeing here the effects, among other things, of the immense changes in communications and transportation that had come down in these various places during the preceding generation. And maybe that's true. It was really a revolution, something like the Internet revolution, to bring in the telegraph at that time. But I don't know. Anyway, there's a move in many places to centralize governments, to bring in stronger nationalisms, to confer wider citizenship rights to people. And generally, we think of it as a modernizing liberalism that's set in many of these countries. Not France and England so much. They'd also had already done many of these things. But Germany, Italy, Mexico, other places, the USA, in the consolidation of the Union, the defeat of the Confederacy et al. during the Civil War. Now, the roles of the institutions, I mean, this was, the executive, after all, is the center of what happened in the U.S. Lincoln in the 1860s. It's the Civil War is an executive enterprise. It's brutal. It's military. It's violent. That's what it is. It's an edge of steel and violence to the whole business. I mean, Lincoln is sometimes compared to Bismarck and Cavour, who are the unifiers of Germany under the Prussians, and of Italy also at that same juncture at the mid-19th century. Then after the war came the occupation of the South by the Union Army, which is a key ingredient. There's a fascinating new book about that, by the way, by Gregory Downes, called After Appomattox. Anybody seen that book? It's just a wonderful book about the Reconstruction and during the years following the Civil War and how important the Union Army was and down there. Without no Union Army, no Reconstruction is what it comes down to. It's yes. Now, I'm not going to talk much about Congress here because I want to leave. It's very important, but I want to leave the discussion until Tuesday. I'm going to enfold what I want to say about Congress at this juncture in American history into a larger discussion. So I'm going to leave it. Generally speaking, what I would say here is that what you find in Congress is a propensity to, all the time, most of the time anyway, a propensity to weigh and to accommodate intensities among voters, whoever those voters may be at various times. And during these decades, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, the voter universe changes greatly, so for various reasons, through various moves. We'll save that till Tuesday. How are we doing? We're doing all right. Next, I want to building an industrial economy. After here, and I want to center on after the Civil War, or starting in the mid-1860s in the USA, is a conventional interpretation. You find it in Beard and Charles Beard and others. What we do find in the last decades of the 19th century is just immense surge in many leading economies toward the development of large-scale industrial capitalism. This emanates, among other things, in continuing rivalry with Britain and later rivalry with Germany as the history heads into 1900 and just after that. These are your great economic powers by 1900 or so. In the USA, here's somebody's interpretation of the 1860s. This destructive though it was, I think this is a conventional interpretation. The Civil War broke the slaveocracy's power to obstruct an American developmental agenda, economically thinking. So I mean, the guards are off. There it could go. The economy could flex its muscles. The people therein could. Now, what happened, after all, of course, in the development of the capitalist big-scale economy of the 19th century was very dominantly a private sector thing. I mean, the government wasn't building railroads. That never would happen. It was the robber barons and all that, the coming of the railroads, the coming of the steel industry, the coming of the various mining companies, and so on. All that, we know that. It's a very private kind of thing, but that doesn't mean there's no place for the government in this enterprise. If it is an enterprise, it's a development rather than enterprise. It's something that came about rather than enterprise in a sense. That is, it isn't if people put up their heads in 1865 and said, let's develop an industrial economy. They didn't do that, but rather it did happen. It was an end state that came about in the relevant countries that one can compare with each other, as I set forth as a comparison goal or standard last time. Well, no, in the U.S., though, the government it has a big role. What I'm going to say here is reasonably conventional, although I've looked carefully at it to find out what the wrinkles are and what the problems are. I think in the interpretations during these decades, it's about 1860, who knows, 1865 up to World War I, something like that, or maybe through 1900. It's difficult to say. It's on my timeline. There was a kind of a division of labor. That is the executive branch, the presidency, the Treasury Department. Generally speaking, they protected the currency. That is, they thought it was very important to maintain a stable currency. The rest of the world, the rest of the developed world during this time was on the gold standard, and therefore the Americans should be on the gold standard too, which should cause problems of deflation, which it did by the end of the century. But one of the guiding arguments was that in order to get investment from Europe, which was really needed in the U.S. in the late 19th century to build the railroads, and otherwise, you have to have the kind of stable economy with a stable currency which will attract European money, which may well have been true. There it was. So the executive, protect the gold standard. Also, occasionally they'd help to manage currency crises, so they weren't very good at it. They'd perk up and try to do it occasionally. And also they put down strikes in the presidency during those decades. This is not looked at too much in the history, emphasized too much. We put down nationwide strikes. This is a rocky time in the industrial order. This is the 70s through World War I. Strikes put down by President Hayes, the Republican, in 1877, by Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, in 1894. They were all doing it. There it was. And it was the division of labor. The courts during these decades, there's much written about that. I'm ignoring the courts in this analysis, but I'm going to bring them up here briefly. I regret ignoring them, but I don't know much about them. The role of the courts to guard property rights and to protect interstate markets, basically. That is, markets across the American states against the intrusions by frisky state legislatures. The Supreme Court was doing that now. But Congress during these years, what we see is a kind of distributive developmentalism. that is passing out goodies, benefits to the end of trying to goose along the economy. The Pacific Railway Act of the mid-1860s, the Land Grant College Act, it does get the more college kids into learning engineering and that sort of thing. Homestead Act, that's the free land out in the West. The protective tariff, the Congress is heavy into putting up, and it was a congressional role. Presidents haven't liked the tariff that much, most of them. They've almost always liked it less than Congress does. Congress it's a distributive benefits kind of thing, and Congress does traffic in that sort of politics very nicely and eagerly sometimes, says we'll give you this, you that, you that, and you that, and add it together in an omnibus bill that makes people very happy, and on Capitol Hill and across the country, people who receive those things to act in that fashion. And that was one of the pictures of, one of the justifications of, or one of the explanations of the high tariff propensity of Congress during those times. But it was more than that. It was a Republican Party platform. The high tariff was a way of competing with the British economy. It's not just a distributive Christmas tree kind of thing, though Christmas tree is a part of it. And Congress had a bent toward silver and inflation more so than the presidency. The silver. The president, the congressmen, they like silver. That is, some of the small states out in the West, they had silver mines. So the states would send people to D.C. who would go there and talk about silver all the time. That happened right into the 1930s. It was that. Presidents didn't kind of like that. Now, this is conventional, I think, what I'm saying here about these times. But I came away thinking that the scholarship of this period is, if anybody's interested in getting a scholarship about this sort of thing, is very stale. That is, we don't have a very good picture of what the government was up to in its scheming and its putting together policies in the Treasury and on the Hill. I mean, it's an interesting question. If you think back in those times, for example, before the Federal Reserve Board came along in 1913 through creation, the stuff that the Federal now does was divided between Capitol Hill and the Treasury Department. It's interesting. They both took a role. It resided in one place. That is, worrying about the currency, stability, and so forth. It was sometimes cooperative and sometimes competitive between those institutions. It's an interesting time, but it needs more work. Next, I want to talk about, I call this one Taming the Corporations and the Rich. And the timeline on this is the late 19th century. What is it? I guess I put it the 1890s through, right up through the 1930s, something like that. Taming the corporations and the rich. And the story on this one is that industrial capitalism came along after all. It's a great big thing. And it was wonderful in some senses, and people thought it was. That is, per capita income in the U.S. tripled over a course of a couple of generations, and that is immense. And felicities came down like being able to ride on a train or order something through a mail or out a catalog. They couldn't do those things in the 1840s. These are very nice. On the other hand, there's a lot of disruption and discontent that what attended the coming of, we know that. We learned this when we were 11, of industrial capitalism during these times. There were strikes. There were immense immigration, people coming in and working very hard in the workplace. There were sweatshops. There's a lot of market volatility. Which afflicted farmers and also afflicted the economy generally during these decades. So it's kind of dicey. So there's a reaction against this, and it's not just in the U.S. Again, it's a transnational thing. These are the decades in which across the comparable countries, a set of countries, we get the development of socialism, the socialist parties. Yeah, Marx was writing earlier, but the great socialist parties come about in the late 19th century. Left liberalism comes into style in Great Britain. I mean, the Liberal Party changes its spots roughly about 1900. In the U.S., we get large doses of populism and progressivism in the late 19th, early 20th century. These are peer enterprises, that is to say, comparable enterprises in these places. In the U.S., what happened in particular is what came about, there's good writing about this by several people recently, is a powerful, what they call an anti-monopoly movement. It was a buzz phrase from a century ago, anti-monopoly movement. It's a big noun on the left that pressed for regulation of business and for progressive taxation through several decades. Both farmers and laborers are involved in it, but it's a particular American twist to it all. I mean, socialism is pretty weak in the U.S. after all as an enterprise. But the thrust toward business regulation and progressive taxation was major. It was probably the American entry into the comparison of this impulse which went across these various countries. Now the story here, I think, is this, that the conventional accounts of all this, they have too much presidentialism. You know, Teddy Roosevelt did this, Woodrow Wilson did that, FDR did that, blah, blah, and that's the end of the story. But that's really very, very, it's off. There's a lot more going on Capitol Hill. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that Congress took the lead, generally speaking, over many decades in regulatory activity and in framing the progressive revenue system over many decades. It's quite interesting to see what they could do on the Hill. Railroad regulation is, let's see, my first quote there. This is Grover Cleveland took no part in any stage of the formulative process of the Interstate Commerce Act. In his message, he never mentioned it, which is interesting. Rights for other railroad regulation going into the 20th century. Labor laws. Labor laws tended to come from Congress. That is, labor management regulation laws. For what it would be, the Davis-Bacon Act in 1931, for example, the construction workers, I'm reaching right into the 1930s here, Norris LaGuardia Act of 1932. It's an important labor law, bubbles right out of the Hill. It's not a presidential thing at all. Also the Wagner Act, the biggest of them all, the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. This is very much Senator Wagner's baby. And Senator Wagner in New York is just an absolutely major figure in American policy history, operating on Capitol Hill for 20 years or so with great impact. He discovered how to have a talented staff, and he used it as a senator in those days. See, what have I got here? The third quote down. The National Labor Relations Act of 35. Wagner was the act's legislative, and Roosevelt was a hard sell on this one. And usually we say that Roosevelt did it, but it's really not correct. I mean, he signed onto it once the Senate had passed it, but the White House had been going to get a block. Yeah, they didn't really like this plan, this kind of a plan for doing things. But then it went on to the books. Is this mic working okay? We're doing all right? All right. Yes, and Progressive Act, excuse me?
Could you push it up where you had it yesterday, please?
I will. Did I have it up here yesterday?
Yeah. Yes.
Is that better?
Thank you. I hope it doesn't
Okay, good. I'm glad you told me. That's fine. That's very good. Yep. I'm glad I asked also. That's fine. Okay. And progressive taxation is a very interesting story. It was Congress that put forth an income tax first in 1894, which was enacted over, Reverend Cleveland wouldn't sign it, it was enacted anyway, then the court struck it down. It was Congress also that generated the 16th Amendment in 1909, that is the Income Tax Amendment, and who devised the mix of the tax in 1913, first time there was a mix. But then the interesting story, I think the most interesting story is from 1916. When the government needed money to get ready for World War I, they needed immense amounts of money to conduct World War I, so what do? Well, the Democrats are running Capitol Hill. They're also running the presidency with Wilson. It's not as if there was great conflict between the Democratic White House and the Democrats on the Hill. Nonetheless, the successful pressure for a pretty stiff progressive tax regime came from the Hill. You see this is from the economic history writer Elliot Brownlee at the bottom. What is the progressive-minded Democratic insurgents could insist that if preparedness for the war, and later the war effort were to move forward, they could do so only on the insurgents' financial terms. And the White House signed on to that. And that meant bringing in a mix of taxation involving an estate tax, which came out of the books for the first time in 1916, corporate taxation, and heavy personal income taxation. That's a mix that dates to 1916. And it's stuck. It's been with us ever since that mix. Now the rates have gone up and down, and some other features of the World War I taxes were dumped in the 1920s. But nonetheless, that basic mix of taxation, which is quite interesting, dates to chiefly to congressional initiative in 1916. It's quite interesting. I mean, this whole think about this as a tax and regulatory regime during these many decades. It's a kind of position-taking politics. I mean, the simple, appealing messages of blame and remedy that could be put out there by politicians and enacted on by Congress, and there it was. And I mean, the taxation, the progressive taxation moves were quite striking. Look at the last quote I've got here by Piketty about, what does he say? Very high taxes on the very rich was He's using the whole thing as a phrase as a noun phrase to start the sentence. Invented in the United States, and he's looking at these developments of the first couple of decades of the 20th century. We don't see anything like a pressure for high taxation today that was there, and these progressive démarches of the first half of the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Onward to the next one. Mike, okay now? Mike, okay. The rise to world power. Now, a lot can be said, and I'm not going to say it. It involves after the Civil War, right up until almost current times, maybe current times. It's hard to say. Rivalry among nation states: USA, the UK, Germany, Russia, the rest of them. All the way along, it's a very familiar story. And and again, there's a lot, and I'm not going to say very much. I could give a full lecture on this one. But I want to say this: distinguishing the branches. That is, action proneness has very ordinarily come from the presidents when there's been and when the Congress is different from the executive branch on policy. The president, generally speaking, has been the proactive one. It's not surprising. It's what you'd expect from a presidency as opposed to a legislature, but there it is. I mean, Jefferson sent his ships to the shores of North Africa in 1803. Obama sends his drones to the Middle East in 2015. That's very much an executive kind of thing to do, after all. It's not surprising. I get the impression that over history, the executive branch taken alone, the presidency within it taken, they would have operated, given their propensities, they would have operated this country something like the British Empire, the same kind of impulses and activities. Whereas Congress, you look at the way they operate and the way they think, they kind of prefer sort of a large Switzerland, just leave them alone. I mean, the Congress they talk a lot, and sometimes they talk as if they really want to fight, but generally speaking, I think the story on the congressional side is insularity. That is, they really don't like to be disturbed by the rest of the world. Your average voter is not much interested in what's going on in the rest of the world, and the Congress caters an awful lot to your average voter out there. So Congress is often foot-dragged or resisted. White House aims for expansions or for invasions or for intrusions or for annexations but also for commitments abroad, all these reaches out to the rest of the world, sometimes to grab things in the rest of the world. Congress has, on balance, especially when there's been difference of opinion between the institutions, been a foot dragger. I mean, this was true in the, they turned down the Versailles Treaty in 1919. They wouldn't let Congress wouldn't join the World Court in the 1930s. There's isolationism in the 30s. There's the helicopter exit from Vietnam in 1975. There it is. A lot of that. There's a lot of that. Right now they won't approve Obama's Iranian deal. You notice, and I think that if to go back a year or so, whenever it was, if Obama had sent up to Congress his plan, which he announced he was going to do, after all, to do some bombing in Syria, they would have rejected that too. I think he backed away from it, from sending it up, for the reason that if they sent it up, he would have lost on Capitol Hill, the way that David Cameron, the head of Britain, had lost in the British Parliament just previous to that by sending something up. I think, there's a lot to be. That's all I want. I thought one interesting story. There's an interesting story that comes out of this, I think. A distinctive imprint of Congress when you put the U.S. against some other countries, like in this case France and Britain. The USA became an imperial power, and a big one, without becoming much of a colonial power. That is, there's a shortage of colonies out there. A shortage, and this isn't to say the U.S. doesn't have great influence in an awful lot of countries in the world, of course they do, but formally controlled colonies, I mean, the way India was to Britain or French West Africa was to France, there's a great shortage of that, given American power. And the reason for that is that Congress just hadn't liked has resisted having colonies. You see that over and over again from the 1860s through the 1920s, which was probably the decisive time for colonial acquisitions in the world. They kept saying no. A lot of reasons. I mean, one of them simply racism. I mean, most places that could have been taken over by the USA did not have white populations, and on Capitol Hill they didn't fancy the idea of having more non-whites in the country. So it was a whites-only kind of country in the view of most members of Congress at most times. There's an interesting story about the Philippines. The U.S. did take the Philippines in 1890, and actually this is a kind of an exception to my story. It's one of the rare times in American history when Congress has been out front in an aggressive way in helping to spur the Spanish-American War in 1898, so it's kind of exceptional in what I'm talking about. But they took the Philippines. But then in the 1930s, they voted Philippine independence. And that's before the French and British were shucking off their colonies. And it's interesting why they did it. Capitol Hill took the initiative. A bunch of reasons. It's fascinating. There was simply anti-imperialism, which is a pretty strong strain on Capitol Hill. It was racism. After all, the Filipinos are not whites. They were anti-immigration in the 1930s, and nativists during the Depression. There was wage competition from Filipinos coming in on the West Coast. There was rioting in California about Filipinos coming in on the West Coast. The sugar interests wanted to put up tariffs against Philippine sugar, and they couldn't do it as long as the U.S. owned the Philippines. There are a lot of reasons there. They put them all together, and they voted Philippine independence, even though, well, at one point Hoover vetoed it, but they got it through. Roosevelt went along with it. That's enough for that one. Onward. Responding to the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression afflicted all over the place, Japan, Germany, everywhere. It was a shared plight in 1931, 32, 33. People fingered towards solutions, what to do. There's a wave of new interesting scholarship here. In this case, in the executive, I think the short story is this one. Franklin Roosevelt made the big moves. I mean, this is canonical, and well, no, it's not exactly canonical. It's just, I think, it becoming canonical. They're going off the gold standard. What's the thing to do? And he did it, finally, in 1933-34. That seems to have made, that's what the economists seem to be telling today. That made the big difference. It wasn't fiscal policy, it was monetary policy that made the difference in generating the recovery. And Roosevelt did it. It was his stuff. It was then the 100 days of legislating, which Roosevelt guided in 1933-34, helped to stabilize the economy through regulating this, that, or another thing, crop prices, mortgages, securities, and so on. So laurels still have got to go FDR there at the executive. Congress's case during the Depression, I think generally speaking they went along with FDR. There was not much friction, not that much friction between the White House and Congress on all this. Insofar as here's how they did distinguish, though. They distinguished in some respects. That is, Congress is more pro-inflation. They're still silver. They're still silver. People came from Nevada and places like that. They wanted to bail out the silver industry. That means inflation. Go for inflation. They had farmer interests that were going for inflation. The White House didn't like that. It was also the most interesting story has to do with veterans' benefits. That is, veterans' bonus. It was the World War I's veterans' bonus, which had to be paid out. The World War I wasn't back there very far. And there's been writing about this by economists going back to 1956, but there's particularly good recent writing about this, about the importance of Congress's voting veterans' bonuses during the 1930s. That's what happened was they voted big payouts of bonuses in 1931. Hoover vetoed it. They passed over his veto. They did it again in 1936, passed over Roosevelt's veto. And the bonus money went out. And it was big money going into the economy. I would guess from reading the various people that of the fiscal, macroeconomic, countercyclical stuff that's done by the government during the 1930s, veterans' bonuses rank very high. They may indeed rank in first place. Other stuff didn't go very far, according to Christina Romer. The bonus in 1936 was very big, and so here's one account of the economic recovery. Recovery in 1936 is more than 2.5 times greater than in the preceding 2 years, and the veterans' bonus paid out in June seemed to have been the basis of that. It's a big thing. America in general during the Depression, I mean, American handling of the Depression, it's no better than generic across a whole bunch of countries probably. I mean, no cigar. The British probably did things just as well. And some things that the government did during the 30s probably didn't help much to get outside of the Depression. I may have heard, for example, big tax hikes that Hoover signed in 1932 and that Roosevelt signed in 35 and 36, the National Recovery Act in 33. Well, it's not a great thing according to most economists. Yes, building a welfare state. This is a big one. Some of this I'm going to leave until next time as I blend some features of it into a larger development, larger interpretation. There's a lot of good scholarship here. I mean, the transnational context is that the American welfare state has been relatively late. It's been relatively small, and it's been relatively private side. There's writing about this here by excellent writing, definitive writing by Jacob Hacker on these subjects. You put the institutions together. The presidents have been, it seems to be interested particularly in big bang welfare state enterprises. Social Security in 1936, that was Roosevelt's baby. The Medicare in 1965, that was at least Lyndon Johnson's baby. Or the Affordable Care Act in 2009, 2010, that was Obama. Shared with Capitol Hill, but Obama was, it was a very big deal for Obama. But Congress is very basic also to the building of the American welfare state. There's a stream of smaller or incremental measures, or middle gauge measures that have come out of Capitol Hill over a long period of time. I mean, children's benefits in 1912, signed by President Taft. Maternal benefits in 1921, signed by President Harding. Public housing in 1937, which Wagner talked FDR into. Disability benefits in 1956, signed by Eisenhower. Supplementary security income in 1972, signed by Nixon. The Earned Income Tax Credit in 1975, signed by Ford. The GI Bills after World War II and since then have basically had congressional provenance, that is. Henry Waxman, the congressman from California, is said to have generated 24 distinctive expansions of Medicaid in the 1980s, and that's documented. There's a full book talking about that, so it's really quite extraordinary. All of it adds up. Now there is some recent path-dependent scholarship, that is to say, American political development folks, they like to talk about path dependence, the big thing. That is to say, what happened a long time ago affects deeply what's happened since then. That's path dependence. There's some path dependence interpretations. It's good, by the way. It makes a lot of sense to say that, and to write scholarship that says it. The keys on Congress, there are three arguments that have come down, and one of them, the first of them I'm going to leave developing or boring into to next time. One is this, is that around 1900 or so, the decades around 1900, Congress was, by the way it operated, discouraged the country from building big, efficient national federal bureaucracies, the way the Swedes, the French, and the Germans have built and maintained big, efficient public bureaucracies. I'll just leave it up in the air. There's an argument there made by Skowronek and by Zita Skocpol, which is a very good one, I think. And a part of this picture is that building early on and expensive and big and need to be administered in a fashion where people weren't stealing money or frittering it away in a Swedish or a German fashion was not easy to do in the USA as of 1900, which is part of the picture. That's one argument. A second path dependence argument is this one, that the progressive taxation which the U.S. during the era I've talked about here got the U.S. into in a big distinctive way. The progressive taxation is the basic resource for the Treasury, for the federal government. It was very good. It pleased a lot of people, and it struck too for the progressive cause. But in the long run, it's not an effective generator of a lot of revenue. That is, ample revenue doesn't easily come in from it. It doesn't work as well as, say, a value-added tax, which is regressive. I mean, a value-added tax is invisible, whereas your income tax is quite visible and therefore vulnerable, and also it's subject to fiddling through tax breaks of the sort that Palomar was talking about last time. In the history of the taxation code, the tax code is, among other things, the history of tax breaks and fiddling, and that part of that attaches, after all, to the income tax itself. Finally, the final argument here is that, this is by Jacob Hacker recently, that some of the important moves by Congress that have affected the way the welfare state operates have come in old revenue bills that we haven't heard much about in 1942 and 1954 that had the effect of shunting the support of welfare provision over into private companies. That's 1952 and 1954. Jacob's done a very good job with that one. I've got three more items to do here, and it's just about going to be right, I think. And then, is that where we are? Yep. I'm on schedule, although that may be baffling you, but I'm on, excuse me again? What did I do?
You're one slide ahead of yourself.
I see. Don't want to do that. Okay. Now we've gone past World War II. And the last three of these are impulses from the late 40s and 50s and 60s, and I guess they extend into the 70s, actually into the 80s. There, but not recently. The two items I'm going to talk about next time are more recent and are still ongoing, but these are out there in the decades after World War II. One of them is this, and I think this merits inclusion on a list. I've written a piece on this, a chapter about this in a book. Looked into it at one point, and I found it fascinating, is that after World War II, one of the big things going on in the Western world in Japan was this never again, we're never going to have a rotten economy the way that we did in the 1930s. We just can't have that anymore. We need prosperity. Not only that, much of the world is wrecked after 19 Germany and Japan in particular. There's a mess out there. There's prosperity, economic growth, and needed all over the place. So let's forget everything else for a while and try to do that. Also, the The Cold War, which came into effect pretty quickly in 1946-47, supplied an initial reason for the American government to try to juice up its own and the European and Japanese economy so they could keep up with or ahead of the Russians. That was it. All that was there. So we have these impulses. It's ideological as well as foreign policy inspiration at that time. So a lot of energy went into thinking into, at the cost of other things, as juicing up the economies, making them run well. And in fact, for the quarter of a century after 1945, up through 1973 or so, the economies of the Western world and Japan are very successful. The growth rate, and a lot of people would give the right arm and the left arm right now for the growth rate that these countries exhibited during those decades. Split it between Congress and the executive. Generally speaking, on the executive side, what we did that came ushered in, after all, after the war, during and after the war, was the location of the Keynesian macroeconomic coordination in the executive branch through the Council of Economic Advisors and the presidents. And the presidents took on the responsibility to coordinate. This is what put forth by this. It seems to have emanated from the experience of World War II and juggling the economies in Britain and the U.S. during that time, as well as in the U.S., particularly the Employment Act of 1946, which gave the executive branch the mandate, after all, to keep twirling the dials to deal with inflation and with growth and with particularly unemployment. There was that. So that's an executive thing. Beyond that, in these decades, the presidents are not unimportant. The presidents I found, I read Eisenhower, it surprised me. I read Eisenhower's memoirs and such. Eisenhower was a big booster, a big promoter of highways and dams and canals. Was Eisenhower? But he's a booster as well as a boaster. You read his memoirs, a quote from Eisenhower's memoirs. This is about the highway system that was put on the books in 1956, the Interstate Highway System, which we all drive on today. The biggest peacetime construction project of any description ever undertaken by the United States or any other country. So that's Eisenhower talking. That's the way he talks about his baby doing that. It's quite interesting, quite interesting. Yes, so, and I think in the case of Kennedy, what I'm talking about here extends through the Kennedy presidency in 1963. If you look at what Kennedy was really interested in, it seems like, in the presidency during his brief years as president, it was a couple of things. It was trade. That is, this trade expansion bill of 1962, which he went to the wall for. It was a chief project during his second year in office. And then his tax cut, which came into effect finally in 1964 after he died in November of 1963. But the tax cut was a big thing for him. And it was, at the end of the day, the way they were justifying it, it was a long-term economic growth kind of move, apparently, the way the writers talk about it. That is, it brought the top, for one thing, it brought I said this last time, the top bracket tax down from 91%, which is a wartime level, to 50%, and it made it permanent. That is, it wasn't to be just a jolt to the economy right now to help it during the next year or two. It was a long-term settlement of American taxation history, and it's one of those path dependence things. As taxes haven't gone higher than that since Kennedy's move. All right, there's that. But then Congress and the executive. I was struck by this, that I found that looking at it in one way, the era of the late 40s, 49 plus, 1950s, and through Kennedy in 1963 stands out as an era of surprising and surprisingly consequential legislative activity. It's not easily looked on that way, and we look back at an awful lot of conflict. But it was not an awful lot of conflicts, a lot of cross-party legislating. Sometimes one party got what it wanted, the other party didn't like it, but still, generally speaking, a lot of cross-party legislating. And I coded this, I thought about this, it was economics, as the animation, what they're aiming for was, it's all economic. Productivity, some combination of productivity, efficiency, development, and growth. These are near synonyms, but no two of them are probably exactly synonymous with any other. That meant, among it, an awful lot of infrastructure development, a big binge of infrastructure development. And of course, we look back at that and we say, we don't like this stuff. We don't like the highways, we don't like the shopping malls, we don't like the bad fish coming into the Great Lakes because they built the canal up there, and so on. There's a lot of stuff we don't like. I mean, it's not correct to look back at these days at what they did. But things can be consequential without being admirable. We have to think about that. There's a lot of consequentiality back there. This is my slide 18. I made a list of laws, or parts of laws that came through legislating, generally cooperative legislation. between the Congress and the presidency, but notice they did this by legislating, not by somebody's executive order. It was actually putting things onto the books through legislating. The creation of the peer review system and through the NSF, which many of us are familiar with, they brought that in. The Truman administration really didn't like that. They wanted more top-down bureaucrats having more of a hand in deciding who should get the money. An authorization by law of offshore oil drilling came about in 53. They bought the St. Lawrence Seaway through authorization in 54. They authorized and brought into existence by law private atomic energy in 1954. They brought in flexible prices in agriculture. The warehouses are filling up with crops because the parity prices that the government guaranteed were so high. The growth-friendly revenue measures under Eisenhower and also through the Kennedy in 1964. Liberalizations of international trade, particularly under Eisenhower in 55, cooperating with the Democrats on Capitol Hill, and Kennedy in 1962. The Upper Colorado River Storage Project, that's a mouthful, but what that means is big dams, Lake Powell, and, substantially anyway, Arizona. That is putting the dams in effect to supply water downstream from the Colorado River up in the high Rockies. This was probably the last very big dam enterprise by the USA. And then the highway program in 1956. This is the big item in it all. What else have I got here? The space program in 1958. Got to keep up with the Russians. Aid for science education in 1958. Area redevelopment by the Democrats in 61. Communication Satellite, putting together a public-private corporation to put a satellite up in there in 1962. It's really quite an interesting, I think, sequence of stuff. I stuck at the bottom of the previous slide here, this quote I copped out of the newspaper from Schiller recently. He over in the economics department, Schiller, what does he say? It's worth noting that the U.S. achieved its fastest economic growth since 1929 in the 50s and 60s, the time of high government expenditure on the interstate highway system, which was launched in 1956. There it all. Okay, post-World War II prosperity. Now, next to last for today is the Civil Rights Revolution. Civil Rights Revolution, not resolution. And I want to put this into a transnational setting, which isn't always done. And in the American case, World War II is a key to this. World War II, I think anyway, reading the history. As of 1939, before the war came on for the U.S., the Southern racial caste system was pretty solidly in place. I mean, it wasn't getting upset. It was down there. Not much was going on. But the war shook things up in a big way in this country and other places. The war became, a lot of reasons. The war became partly a campaign against racism, at least on the European front by the Allies, at least partly that. African Americans got entailed into the army, into the workforce in an important way. I think the country seemed to look around and say, what have we been doing all these decades? It was so nasty. The whites saying that. It looks like that anyway. So what happened was that when the war ended and the civil rights, the public opinion polls took off. They started surging toward the more favorable attitudes toward civil rights among whites. You see that starting in the mid-1940s and zooming up to the mid-1960s. When the civil rights revolution in the U.S. through legislative action did occur, after all, in the mid-1960s, 1964 and 1965, and some. Well, now, the interesting thing is that there was a similar post-World War II policy surge across the other ex-British settler states, as USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Is a quotation from Michael Lind. The other English-speaking democracies, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, not just the settler states, but Britain itself, all abolished their white supremacist civil rights laws and whites-only immigration policies at the same time that the United States did. That's basically the 1960s, centering in the 1960s. What we're seeing is a similar or comparable or the same impulse that's extending across these countries, and it's a familiar pack of countries. If you're looking for comparisons and similarities and analogies, there it is. And now that meant, for the Americans, after all, that meant a large African-American population. That wasn't the case in these other colonies, except for South Africa, which in some respects fits into this generalization also. In the other countries, it means Asian peoples or possible Asian immigrants. It means indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand, and in Canada. And what happened in the mid-60s, I mean, the general pattern is of an extension of universal citizenship rights, including voting rights, across race in these various countries. And every one of these countries made moves in that direction around in the 1960s. There's also a deracialization, so to speak, of immigration in these various countries. I mean, the effect of the Immigration Act in 1965 in the USA was to open the USA to immigration from Asia, for example. It had been quite closed until 1965. And the other countries also put laws on the books deracializing their immigration policy. Canada did it, for example, in 1962. It's really quite interesting. And now I would like, somebody should make a comparative study of the evolution of policy positioning by the American Democratic Party on the one hand, and the Australian Labor Party on the other hand. These are very comparable parties in some ways. I mean, they were, a century ago, they were both stern guardians of white supremacy in the USA and in Australia. In Australia, it was chiefly to guard against immigration from Asia. In the U.S., it was that on the West Coast, as well as attitude to the African-American population. But it was those parties, Australian Labor, American Democrats, who had that particular very strong policy position. But after the war, both of them, apparently about the same time, surged into being the spear carriers for civil rights in Australia and in the USA. It looks like on a common schedule. It's very interesting. Now, the presidency and the Congress, the president took the lead, and the courts did in the USA in the 1950s and 60s. We know that. We know that they started with Truman. Truman went out front publicly with a pro-civil rights position in 1946, more than any president had done that in the 20th century, previous president. And then the courts got into it, and we know that too. But Congress was laggard. I'm not going to take this up today. This is something that's going to fold into my discussion on Tuesday. Congress is very laggard on civil rights. We know that too, as we all learned it in elementary school. It's there, but I'll take it up next time. The last two, we're getting fairly close, but we're not violating too much the rules of this game. The next one I'm calling sleekening the economy, by which I mean the onset of the insurge of neoliberalism into the economies and the political thinking and the political action of the world in the 1970s and in the 1980s. The transnational setting was that economic formulas that had worked before didn't seem to be working anymore. What with the coming of stagflation and the rest, there was a lot of despair and a lot of twirling on something like what Hoover was doing in 1931. People didn't know what to do in prescribing policy formulas. So one result of that, apparently, was that neoliberalism came in and just made a very big impression across much of the world. And again, especially a commonality, it appears. Again, it's the same pack of countries across the U.S. and the other British countries. That is, the U.S., the U.K., Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all took very, very heavily to neoliberalism in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s. What that meant was moves into privatization, into deregulation, into tax cuts, into weakening of the unions, and a back away from Keynesian formulas for managing the economy. All those things are going on in all these countries in various measures. It's interesting that in New Zealand, a very stern neoliberal program was undertaken and carried by a Labour Party government, not by a Conservative Party government down there. It's quite interesting. Now, presidency and Congress, there are differences there, and there are differences between the parties. There are very clear differences between the parties in the U.S. and in the U.K. An odd one in New Zealand, but the U.S. and the U.K. I mean, Reagan and Thatcher are one thing, and the Democrats and the Laborites over there are another thing. Reagan being particularly tough on unions and on taxes. Thatcher particularly tough on unions and privatization. All this is well known. But generally speaking, that aside, I mean, there are these partisan differences, but generally speaking, beyond that, what I'm calling the neoliberal impulse invested both branches of the American government and both parties in the days of Ford and Carter and Reagan. It's kind of a comprehensive invasion, sort of, with partisan differential there. Not much differencing between Congress and the presidency. Generally speaking, they cooperated, some taking the lead on some things, some on others, but it's it's, a lot of this is the Democrats. For example, it was under Carter and Ford before him, and with a Democratic Congress in the 70s, that we got deregulation of trucking, deregulation of the airlines, deregulation of railroads, deregulation of oil and gas prices, The first deregulation of the savings and loan banks came in 1980. This is all under the Democrats. This is all before Reagan reached the White House and went into his own deregulatory moves and into tax cutting in 1981. The Revenue Act of 1978, was done by the Democrats, was a slash of capital gains taxes that was brought about by Carter in a Democratic Congress. That's also under the Democrats. There was a lot, in short, there was a lot of cross-partisan lawmaking at that time. It tends to get overlooked for that reason. As people look back in their history, they want to see one party battering the other party. If one party isn't battering the other party, it must be that nothing is going on, which is not a good way of looking at the world. Now, I think that the neoliberal, is that the end of my list? Yes, that's it. Neoliberal impulse, it's a surprising and powerful thing that came along, and very surprising and powerful, intellectually powerful and politically impactful at that time, and the impact goes on. But I do think that it did its work, so to speak, as an impulse a while ago. It's not right now. I don't see innovation out there now. Somebody brought this up last time. I think that neoliberalism as an innovative, bringing about different kinds of deregulation and tax cutting and so forth, it's pretty much petered out and being innovative maybe 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. Now, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to leave the last two items, number 12 and number 13, which are, climate change I'm going to deal with, and the problem of dealing with debts and deficits. I'll take those up next time. They're both on the table right now. They're still on the table. Plus, that should take me about 10 minutes next time, and the rest of it will be an interpretive discussion, picking up a couple of themes that I want to dwell on. One is which I began at the beginning, the place of Congress in the legitimizing of the system. That is, the relation between Congress on the one hand, legitimacy and stability of the system on the other. I want to take that up. And then I want to take up as a separate matter, and this picks up some of the instances, some of the 13 also, the messiness of congressional lawmaking. A messiness, meaning inconstancy, incoherence, particularism, and how that comes down, what it amounts to. In some respects a bright side to it, in some respects not a bright side, in some respects a side which isn't clear whether it's bright or not. That's it.
Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions before calling it a day.
No, we got one. I see. I'm wrong. Do we have until, how long we got anyway? Did I take too long? Did I take too long?
No.
No, okay. Go ahead, sure. No questions. That's all right. Okay, I solved everything.
I had a question about the sort of empire building.
I can't quite hear you. Keep going.
Yeah, I have a question about the colonial issue that you raised. And you said, well, that the U.S. didn't have colonies because of congressional opposition.
Yeah.
And so that just made me think of some of the European cases where you had strong parliamentary or congressional opposition to colonies, and yet you had a bunch of colonies. So in France and Britain at various times, you have parliamentary strong opposition to adding more colonies to the empire. And yet a combination of factors there, let's see. So competition with immediately adjacent powers in Europe, action by individual military leaders on the spot, very clever royal or executive action led to you basically developing colonies in those situations, even though Parliament originally was dead set against these colonies. So I just encourage you as you write up, I suppose, to add in some consideration of these other factors as well as congressional opposition that might have been responsible for the U.S. getting colonies or not getting colonies.
Okay, well taken. That's well said. Well said. I don't know what to say in response. It just seems to make good sense. I do see the instances are, there are instances for several decades. President Grant really wanted to cede Santo Domingo, which meant the Dominican Republic, and they stopped him. They just stopped him. And the presidents in the 20s, or Teddy Roosevelt, they were mucking about in the Caribbean. You couldn't keep, their fingers kept reaching for Haiti and Nicaragua and Dominican Republic again. And there was a stern opposition to that on Capitol Hill. and which is interesting. And it is true, after all, that the Congress has an awful lot of power vis-a-vis the presidency, which should not be the case with, so much anyway, with rump groups in the British Parliament. Maybe they can be overridden in the British Parliament. The French is another case. The committees are pretty strong there, too. I don't know how to think about that one during these decades. Yeah, but I hear you. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned Germany and France much in your notes. I wonder what's the implication of that? Because I think of there being two of the 6 major powers
Yes.
in the world.
I think, what's a good question? Let me see now. I think that one answer to that is that for some purposes, when I'm looking for peer countries out there to make comparisons with, the British settler states and Britain itself make for the best territory. I mean, for example, the neoliberalism. There's a style of neoliberalism that sets in to all these British countries very similarly. Whereas you get in the continent and you run into economies that are corporate in style, and they didn't react in the same way, so far as I know about it, to the stagflation problem around in the 1970s. Then also the colonies, well, actually the Germans. I mean, the Germans did have colonies in Africa, but they lost them, and they lost them in World War I. They just went away. So there isn't any comparison there that's possible as we get past World War II. So we can't do that one. For some purposes in the Germans, so I mean, I was talking about great power rivalry or with building an industrial economy in the late 19th century. I mean, the Germans are there. They're right on the list. They're right on the list. Or after World War II, I didn't mention the Germans, but after all, the animation toward economic growth, that'll be there in Germany and Japan as well as in the other countries. I just didn't specify the countries. A specification would bring them up in a hurry. The place is wrecked, after all, and is a very strong exhibit for economic growth starting in the late 1940s. No question about that. Germany, yeah, better than England in that respect as an instance. You know, that's the best I can do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for waiting. Excuse me.
Just one question, David. Namely, when you get to the word sleekening of the economy,
Well, I can't quite hear it. Put the mic up closer.
sleekening word in your impulses,
Yeah.
sleekening.
What?
Sleekening.
Sleekening, yeah. I made that up term.
I know you did, and it suggests, however, a positive judgment. That is to say, making something sleeks implies you approve of what's happened, whereas it would seem to me that some of what you list, indeed, that happened with the sleekening of the economy would be judged by at least a portion of the United States as in negative terms.
Well, I meant it to be descriptive. I see your problem. I see that, but I do mean it to be descriptive. I think it's I was looking for a descriptive term, and this seems to be nice. I couldn't find a good one otherwise. I didn't particularly want to say neoliberalism is too clumsy. So I mean it as descriptive. I don't mean it as normative. And maybe it comes across in a fashion I didn't quite intend. Yeah.
I take your point concerning New Zealand and fitting into that category. And within that general thrust.
Put it close. I'm having a little trouble again. There's a muffle today in the mic. I don't know why.
New Zealand fits into the category that you're discussing. But the way it works out, or we were in New Zealand a couple of years after the reforms were instituted by the Labour government, and there's the way it worked out in New Zealand versus the United States is very different. In New Zealand, the people who implemented reforms were in the ministries.
Where's what?
It was not academic. In the United States, there were a lot of academics. You had the Chicago School. You had in the university. You had Robert Bork writing about antitrust. In New Zealand, it was all in the ministries, had nothing to do with academics. It was all economists. So the way it worked, the mechanics of how it worked out in New Zealand, I don't know about the other countries.
Where did they get their ideas?
The U.S.
Pardon?
It was all American.
What?
The ideas were from the U.S.
Yes, that's enough. That's enough.
But it was not transmitted to the lawyers.
I mean, it's like the Chicago folks going to Chile. I mean, it doesn't. Ideas can. I don't care whether it went through people who were. It doesn't make a difference to me. That I mean, the impact is there.
But in the U.S. it worked out it was much broader and deeper because you had in economics, in law and economics, you actually had a law and economics movement which involved lawyers. In New Zealand, there was none of that, zero.
None of it? None of what?
There was no law and economics movement in New Zealand.
Oh, I see the point. Well, why do they need it if they're just borrowing ideas from the U.S.? I mean, it's too small to have a law and economics movement. Why do they need it? It's just, but they got the ideas are pervading.
Well, no,
I think.
it suggests that the movement was in some ways narrower, responding to the economic necessities of the time, that they were nearly bankrupt, and that there was no broader political support. It was much more narrowly focused.
Well, there's not an awful lot of broad political support in the USA either. I mean, deregulation did not have broad political support. It comes out of it scoops out of the academies into the minds of people in the government. It's not as there are pressure groups out there wanting the deregulation. Just not true.
One more question we have time for, if there is one. Yes, sir.
I'm just trying to fill a silence. I haven't noticed anywhere in your discussion an evaluation of the character, the strength or weakness of character of congressmen, senators, or representatives. And I think a lot of them would make good neighbors and good cousins. But I think, and I'd like you to comment on my feeling, that they all act like irresponsible children, and they hope the money will keep coming in because they know how to spend it.
Well, there's a lot of that. I mean, they're not better than we are. They may be worse in some respects in the way they operate in their lives and in their careers. After all, what would you expect? I mean, the Congress doesn't have a good press when people have looked at the people. I mean, Tocqueville writing about the House. This is not an admirable bunch of people. They come in, they fight on the floor, they spit too much. It's not a good group. It's not, and responding to animations from interest groups or from people who give money or from constituents, what would you expect? That's what you're going to get in a legislature where you got individual members. It goes way back. There it is. There it is. So you just have to figure that in to it all. And if you can invent a counterfactual world where they're going to be better people, that would be something. But it's tough. It's tough. They have to get elected after all. And what are they like? I remember I was watching some time ago some television program where somebody was interviewing House pages. That's back when they had them, pages, these kids who are pages on the House floor. And we get this wide-eyed kid who comes in and he says, I really like it in the House. It's just like high school, he said. It's just like high school. That's what they're like. And there it is. It's so of course all those things are going to be true. So, excuse me?
I said, oh, geez.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, we will adjourn and take things up again on Tuesday.
What's that again?
We will adjourn until next
Take
week.
it up again next Tuesday. We'll do that, sure. Yep. We'll
Thank
do
you,
that.
David.
Yep.